Yes, so thanks again for the nice introduction, Marianne. The first disappointment of the day today, I'm not going to talk about charging infrastructure. I'm not going to talk about e-roaming. What else could I talk about? I would like to talk about with you guys about cooperation formats and also some personal observations on the last 6 years at Hubject, not only concerning my company, our company, Hubject, but also as collaboration is basically part of our DNA at Hubject. That means, as you know, that also implies the introduction of the company. For those of you who don't know us that well already, we're a B2B marketplace, and we team up basically with other players in the charging infrastructure market, and that includes, of course, big enterprises, big car manufacturers, big energy companies, but also the small ones, of course. We don't forget about the small ones, startup companies, digital disruptors, and of course also fleet companies and what we would call the German Mittelstand. And somehow we have to organize all of those very heterogeneous companies to a homogeneous charging infrastructure that's digitally accessible. And this is what I would like to discuss with you guys in the next 30 minutes. What are the drivers for success when we talk about organizations, when we talk about collaboration of startups with big enterprises, and also maybe what can you do wrong when you do that? Before we jump into the topic, I just wanted to give you a few updates also on the company in general. And that is, of course, besides the core business, as you know, and I have to admit that we're a little bit proud about that after founding Hubject in 2012 in Germany and spreading the word in Europe, probably you have recognized that we also have more and more international guests on board today, and some of the guests are also now part of our company. That's our daughter company in the US and also our daughter in China, and we hope talking about international interoperability, we can continue on that story. And I think that's also, again, when we talk about international collaboration for startups and big corporations, quite relevant. But first of all, I would like to ask you a question here. May I see some hands? Who of you guys would consider yourselves being corporates? May I see some hands? All right. BMW is not a startup, right? Okay, who are the startups here in the room? Oh, wow. Oh, wow. There are many, actually. And who of you guys is still undecided? And what's that? All right. So I would say almost 50-50. I think that's a perfect touch point for a discussion on that topic. Of course, if you talk about that topic, you can read a lot of stuff about it. And I have to admit, I had an interesting phone call yesterday with a good partner of Hubject, and he asked me basically, what do you want to talk about tomorrow? And I was like, yeah, this year I want to talk about a little bit a different topic compared to the last years. I would like to talk about organizational stuff, collaboration forms for startups and big enterprises. And he was like, come on, Thomas, forget it. That's such an old piece of cake. No one is interested in that anymore. It's not really interesting. But still, if you look what's currently happening in the market, I would say, having big oil companies, big infrastructure companies on shopping tour, it's important to ask what are the main triggers. And as said, you can read a lot about it when you look into certain books. And what you see here on that slide as a first intro is some insights on what big enterprises think about startup companies. And not so much surprising, I would say. Of course, startups are fast. They're quite innovative. They're interesting because of their technologies. Some of them are even disruptive, which is also quite relevant in the current market that we're working in. And vice versa, startups about corporates, Some also bad associations, corporates being slow, I think not really something new, bureaucracy, but also the big money is behind the corporates and possible access to clients. This is just a brief introduction. I will come back to that later on, what that might lead us to when we think about real cooperation. So I just asked the question, who in the room is a corporate, and about 83% of the corporates actually would like to deal with startup companies. They think it's helpful to cooperate, to partner up with startup companies, but only 28% of them are experienced in that. So I think that's also an interesting indication for improvement, of course, if that's a critical part, but that's a discussion for us for the next half an hour, if you agree or not, if that is a critical part. So, of course, there are so many forms for corporate and startup collaboration. I would like to only focus on the most important ones, which is, of course, what you see on this curve here on the upper right, so corporate venturing, M&A, and real collaborations. Therefore, I would like to structure my presentation in 3 steps. So why is it interesting at all to partner up with startup companies or with corporates? And what are triggers to do it right or to do it wrong? How to do it? And of course, at the end of the day, I would like to check if you agree to my thesis. If you don't agree, that will be interesting for me. So a wise man once said, no matter who you are, most of the smartest people work for someone else. And I think this applies to all of us, but is it really relevant for our daily work life? Is it really relevant for the topic I'm going to discuss today with you guys? To answer that, I would like to have a little flashback to the presentation from my keynote from last year. And the topic of last year was, it was about mobility services, about e-mobility services. And I had a very, very, I would say, common sense thesis. We have 2 disruptive technology shifts in the next 2 decades. The one is the electrification of the powertrain. That means combustion engines will be basically substituted by electrical powertrains. I think this has a strong impact on our economy. I think this has a strong impact on the whole supply chain of building a vehicle, building a car. I'd say, I hope we would agree to that. And second, we talked about mobility as a service, autonomous driving today already a lot. And probably even more disruptive, the whole hardware economy will more and more shift to a software economy, and therefore you will sell a service in the future. So this is where we all start, because we're all working in that industry, right? We're working in the mobility industry, electric cars, energy industry. And now it's the second point, and that's quite interesting. In 1950, the average company lifespan was about 60 years. So on an international level, an average company had about 60 years of lifespan until the company basically was dead. Nowadays, we're at about 5 years on average. And I think this is relevant for both startup companies, of course, but startup companies, frankly speaking, they're always fighting against death, right? But there are many examples. I don't want to mention them all. I think they are well known for disruptive technologies where even big corporations had problems with surviving. So you're in that industry. We are waiting for two disruptions, actually. We are just at the tipping point. Remember that example from Mr. Cheche with a ketchup bottle, right? And average time of a company is 5 years. So for the next one, and this is, I guess, at least as interesting, the companies that are on board, they manage to grow and to scale much, much faster than this was the case in the past. So if you look at all the companies that are, unicorns or that have a billion-dollar evaluation, it goes much, much faster to reach that stadium as a company. What does that mean? It might imply that someone else will eat your lunch tomorrow or in the future. And maybe some of the companies you don't even know. But as a corporate, as a big enterprise, you might have the money and the power to do something about that. So, if you look at the success factors in general for startup companies, and that's also, I'd say, a little bit of a surprise, the most critical thing, and again, please have in mind we're waiting for two disruptional technology shifts, is timing, by far. Funding is only number 5, and also the idea is somewhere in the middle of what are the most relevant triggers for the success of a startup company. By the way, this is a study from the US, and this survey basically analyzed the 200 most popular startup companies in the last two decades, including also companies like Uber or Airbnb. And this was the result. So I'd say that's quite surprising. Of course, those are just some of the factors why you might collaborate as a corporate with a startup company, or why it might be interesting for you as a startup company to collaborate with a big enterprise. But let's see, and this is of course also more and more a reflection of my personal work also at Hubject, because we're what you would maybe consider being a corporate startup, and I personally have to say I hate the term corporate startup. If I think about a corporate startup, it somehow reminds me of a party where you went to as a teenager, and then you see your mother and your father entering the party with a very short skirt and with teenager clothes to somehow be part of the story. Therefore, if you're an entrepreneur, if you're a startup, I would say you have to be a real startup, and it's not relevant if it's corporate or not. But let's see what's the reality, and a lot of stuff happening currently if you follow the media also in our market. I would like to quote Mike Tyson first. So he once said, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. And I think you would agree that still most of those collaborations, especially when we talk about M&A, or if we talk about also acquisitions of companies, they fail or they are very, very tough. So let's do that reality check. What are the most relevant reasons why a lot of those collaborations fail? I would just like, due to time, I would just like to highlight the 3 most relevant ones. And number 1 by far is speed. And again, if you match that to what you heard before, success factors for a startup, that was timing. Number 1 was timing. It was not the idea, it was not funding, it was not timing. I think that's highly relevant. And the number 2 is a poor coordination, and number 3 is already culture. And I would say those 3 topics are somehow, if you play it cleverly, it's possible to organize them. So, of course, my humble opinion and my humble proposal is as a corporate, it's very, very important to articulate your expectation concerning the startup company. Therefore, it's okay to be vulnerable. So for big corporation, vulnerability is a word that is hardly known. So everything has to be perfect. It's not okay to fail. And I would say, even though this is very tough to achieve, a controlled failure is something that is from much more higher importance nowadays. So you have to be very precise to handle the expectations of both companies, and that includes the corporate company, but also the startup. It's important to show trust. It's important to have a relationship that allows failure for both sides, because at the end of the day, you have to know what you want from the startup company, and the startup company has to know what they want from you guys. And you know that quote already. I think Elon Musk once said, if you're not failing, you're not innovating. So controlled failure, I think that is the magical word. But if you match that to the core intentions to why those companies collaborate, you see there is kind of an expectation asymmetry. And that is very, very, very often the case. Let's talk about people. So I think you all agree, only with the right people you can manage to be successful. What you often see is that if you look at a business, you can simplify the business in 3 different areas. First of all, and this is often called horizon number 1, this represents the core business and the core products that are currently providing the profit. And the goal is, of course, maximizing that business case and basically, getting maximal profit out of the business. This is what normally big corporations do. And for this particular task, you need special people. And in most cases, those people are maybe not the right people for horizon number 2 or horizon number 3, in which you more work on emerging opportunities that are likely to generate sustainable profit in the near future, with a moderate risk or with a high risk, or when we talk about horizon number 3, also, let's call it the crazy place, right? Where no one really knows what's happening. And therefore, I would say it's very important to work with the right people. If you see what's currently happening, especially for spin-off companies, the number 1 picks, especially for C-level of spin-off companies, of big corporations, for their startups, for their spin-offs, is most of the times their own people. In some cases, and it's not too rarely seen, it's even the people you want to get rid of, right? You want to put them as far away from you as possible. This is really often seen still for this very, very important task, and therefore it's hard to, of course, be successful. And from my own observation at Hubject, we call that the chain dog dilemma. It's also the case if you have job interviews with people that come from horizon number 1, and they're really, really brilliant in that phase for horizon number 1. If you ask them, are you ready for horizon number 3? Are you ready for the new products? Are you ready for the crazy stuff? Are you ready for the innovations? I would say 99% of the people in job interviews, they would basically answer you, of course, this is what I always wanted to do, right? This was always my dream, to get the freedom, to get the independency, to get the possibility to see results and to work on results every day. And why the chain dog dilemma? I would say for most of the people coming from horizon number 1, as soon as the chain is off, they will go back to the dog's house, right? And this doesn't mean that they are not good employees. This does not mean that they are not performers, not at all. But it's just very, very important that you have a look at what kind of people do you need for the endeavor. And of course, you have the horizon number 3 people also working in big corporations. And of course, they have the value, and of course, you should use them in the right way. But of course, also, I have to admit, they're quite rare. So, as a last point, I think most of you know that term. It's very, very important that if you choose for C-level management, if you choose to buy a company, a startup company, if you choose to come up with a spin-off that's independent, that's fast, that's agile, you have to believe and you have to promote the entrepreneurial culture of this company. Because what's the reason to do that? Normally the reason to do that is you believe that this company will do certain jobs much better than you would do it, right? Because otherwise you don't have to create a spin-off. Otherwise you don't have to cooperate with those companies. So therefore, again, trust and vulnerability, it's important. That doesn't mean that everything will go smoothly from the first point of time, but without trust, it's, of course, hard to create a long-term relationship and to see a great result at the end of the day. And so therefore, it's also relevant what kind of framework you put on those companies, When we started at Hubject, and I think that is an example that is seen often, with a very, very good intention, the shareholders try to help us, the shareholders try to promote us, the shareholders try to talk to us. But of course, if you believe in a company, if you believe in the people, because you choose the people to solve the job, they have to do, sooner or later, they have to do it alone, and they have to be capable to solve their problems. And therefore, it's important that you focus in the first place on operational synergies. That means let the salespeople talk to each other, let the product people talk to each other, but not in a format that is kind of pressurized. And companies, they have 10 to 15 shareholder meetings after the founding phase. I think it's crazy. I think you have to decrease the conversation level to a minimum if you believe in the founders and if you believe in the entrepreneurs. And this is what I would like to close with. So the collaboration between corporates and startups, it must be a collaboration on trust, because sooner or later, if you do overselling, if you don't show yourself vulnerable, if you don't commit to possible failures, sooner or later, I think this will also, of course, be visible, and then you wasted a lot of time. And this is where I would like to close and pass the word forward to you guys to match what you just heard. Some of the stuff, of course, talking about companies, startups, big enterprises in general. Some of the stuff more personal from my private experience, but I would be happy to discuss and see if you have the same opinion or if there are points where you don't agree. Thank you.